Our gospel lesson comes from the Gospel of John, chapter 13, verses 1 through 17 and 31 to 35. Now before the festival of the Passover, Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart from this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The devil had already put it into the heart of Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray him. During supper, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God, got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. And then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, "Lord, are you going to wash my feet?" Jesus answered, "You do not know now what I am doing, but later you will understand." Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." And Jesus said to him, "One who is bathed does not need to wash except for the feet, but is entirely clean. And you are clean, though not all of you." For he knew who was to betray him. For this reason he said, "Not all of you are clean." After he had washed their feet, had put on his robe, and had returned to the table, he said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for that is what I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." When he had gone out, Jesus said, "Now the Son of Man has been glorified, and God has been glorified in him. If God has been glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself, and will glorify him at once. Little children, I am with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Will you please be seated? Join with me in a word of prayer. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your eyes. For you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. For 3 weeks here, we are talking about service. Last week we talked about Mary and Martha and the different ways that we serve. Next week we'll look at the importance of our spiritual gifts and not hiding our talents. This week, we pause to reflect on what for me is one of the most powerful moments of Scripture in John's Gospel, where Jesus washes his disciples' feet. This is one of those passages that we usually look at around Easter, and some churches are big into doing the foot washing things where members practice the servant leadership by washing one another's feet. Even Pope Francis or the current Pope will wash feet, and sometimes that can be kind of a big deal depending on whose feet he washes. Some churches will adjust the ritual slightly to do a hand washing because washing one another's feet seems to be very personal and sometimes very uncomfortable thing. And it's interesting that while the other 3 Gospels have Jesus instituting the Lord's Supper, in this passage, he is instead washing the disciples' feet. So there's still this deep connection between foot washing and communion, and it comes down to self-sacrifice and hospitality. It's curious to me, as I was reading this passage, what I realized for the first time is that the commandment about how to eat the Passover was that on any other night, you'd have come into the house, you'd have taken your sandals off and eaten just like you were relaxing at home. But on the Passover, as it says in Exodus chapter 12, verse 11, you're to eat the Passover with your shoes on and your traveling cloak on, and you're ready to get up and run at a moment's notice, because it was a reminder that the people in Egypt were to be ready to go when that final plague had happened and when Pharaoh released the people. So why, if they're eating a Passover meal here, are they taking their shoes off and washing feet? It's curious to me. I'm suspecting that in this moment, Jesus is trying to do something different, and he's trying to put more of an emphasis on that service and on hospitality. Like the Lord's Supper, he's trying to take something that they've done in the past, and he's giving it new meaning. He's trying to show them what it means to be a servant leader. And he does it by taking on a role that wasn't exactly considered high class or valued very much. And he asks his disciples to accept his doing this for them. So let's take a look there first. I fully admit I'm a bit like Peter. To allow someone to do something for me that is wrapped up in some level of shame or embarrassment is hard. Like Peter, I would be a bit scandalized if, for example, my bishop or district superintendent came in and said, "Here, let me wash your feet. Let me do that for you." So Peter at first rejects allowing Jesus to do this for him. And I totally get it. It's hard to allow someone else to do something, especially when I've been raised with that mentality that I can do it all for myself and I don't need anybody else to do it for me. But here's the thing. We are not meant to be alone on this earth. We are not individual silos. We are connected to one another. And by allowing someone else to serve us once in a while, we give them the opportunity to be Christ-like. And the act of asking for help can be empowering because it requires us to be in touch with our needs and to recognize that we are important enough to ask for help in meeting those needs. In fact, people get in trouble far more because there's something that they need, but they're not asking for it, and so they get that need met in an unhealthy way rather than in a healthy one. And picture this scene. You and about a dozen of your closest friends are gathered together. You're going to be sharing together in a meal. You've walked miles and miles and miles on a dusty road. Your feet could be sore at the very least, and at worst, blistered, cracked, bleeding. Maybe they even smell a little bit. And everyone's in the same boat. Now, normally there's someone whose job it is to wash feet. You might not always see them or notice them, but they're there. Usually a servant of some kind, often the term is slave actually, and they would bring a bowl of water and a towel and they would wash and dry your feet. But on this occasion, there's no one there. And you're looking around at your buddies and everyone's like, "I'm not washing anybody's feet here." And finally, Jesus sighs. He takes off his robe, wraps the towel around himself, and he takes on that role. I cannot emphasize enough what a scandal this would have been. A respected teachers doing servants, or dare I say, a slave's work. The scandal was in some ways on the disciples, and yet it fits well into Jesus' style of teaching. He's often advocating for those in society who are looked down on, ignored, treated as second-class citizens. And he often does this by taking on those roles himself. I don't know how many of you have seen the show Undercover Boss, and to some extent I find it a little bit kitschy, but the concept of a high-level leader in the company going out and doing ordinary things, seeing what it's like in the lives of the frontline workers is a powerful thought. How often are we willing to do the things that no one else is willing to do? Are we willing to be the CEO who leads by occasionally scrubbing toilets, by taking on the things that might otherwise get handed down to somebody else? And some might say that Jesus is lowering himself to the level of a servant, but I realized that what is more likely happening is that Jesus is elevating those who we ignore into places of dignity. In other words, he's saying that we should start paying attention to those roles. Jesus is addressing the very structures of power and inequality themselves. He's bringing dignity to those thankless jobs and is saying maybe once in a while we should thank the people who do them and maybe even help out. For me, I think about those nurses and aides who are the backbones of providing medical care for others. I think about the people who work hard every day to make sure that people are fed or taught. For the people who collect trash and clean up after others, all of those jobs. And frankly, I think about the fact that we call them unskilled labor. I don't think so. Every job has skills to it. And just because we value certain skills over others doesn't mean that that's the way that it should be. It's all skilled. In a society where those in power did everything that they could to hold on to it, Jesus gave up all of his power to do something that was ultimately powerless. And guess what, folks? Jesus is calling us to do the same. That's why we serve. We're called to serve because we recognize that there are those structures of injustice, and we're called to address them. Jesus, who proclaims sight to the blind, release to the captive, calls us to be in service to those in need. And it's not always pretty or convenient. It puts us in circles of people that we wouldn't normally choose to hang out with. And it asks us to face the reality that there but for the grace of God go I. It reminds us of our common humanity and the fact that we are all in this world together. We're only as good as we treat the least in our society. And so by Jesus taking on the role of the least is setting that example for us. That service is something to aspire to and seek rather than looking down our noses at. And finally, we're left with the new commandment. This is that place where Jesus leaves with that one last nugget of wisdom, the one thing that defines who we are called to be as followers of Christ. He says, just as I have loved you, so you are to love one another. And again, I'm reminded that love is not always this warm, fuzzy, happy feeling. Love is challenging. It's a choice every day to say that I want to be in a relationship with you. And so Jesus is giving himself up for us. And taking on the role of the least of these, he's showing us how to be a living example of love to one another. I talked about how difficult it can be to accept something from others. I think the same is true with love. It's easy to be skeptical about love, to assume ulterior motives, to see it as only an act of manipulation. And yet, only when we are capable of freely receiving love can we truly have the capacity to love others. I think that's why Jesus was so insistent with Peter. How are we willing to receive that love from one another and thus share that love with others? And then we're defined by that love. It's a powerful thought, and it's in many ways convicting to think about the fact that if we are not loving, then we are not really living out Christ's commandment for us. It's a powerful reminder that we're not Christians by acting high and mighty. We're not Christians by trying to force and convince others to believe as we do. And we're not Christians simply by going around touting our faith. Instead, we're called to put that faith into action and to become the living embodiment of love. That's what Jesus did. Jesus showed us how to become love in the flesh. My hope and prayer for you this week is that you're able to do two things. First, find a way to receive love. If you struggle with truly loving yourself, listen to the words that you speak to yourself and the actions that you show. Do something that communicates to yourself that you are worthy of love and allows you to experience love. And then once you've done that, share the love of God with others. Find a way to be in service and to be the face of Christ to someone. It doesn't have to be a huge thing. It can be as simple as a warm smile and a hello to someone you're around all the time, but don't often interact with. Find a way to do as Jesus did, and use what power you have to advocate for those who don't have power. Be willing to take on that role of serving others. In doing so, the presence of God is made manifest here and now, and they will know that we are Christians by our love. To God, who blesses us in many ways and who loves us and calls us to serve, we give our thanks and our praise. Amen. One way that we do share